Welcome to The Mixer. This is Andy Marshall. I'm here with my friend Juan Carlos Lopez. How are you doing, JC?
Doing very well, Andy. Enjoying the last few days of the summer. So, who is our guest today, Andy? I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Our guest today is Charles Fracchia. Charles is CEO of Black Mesa, which is a Boston startup currently in stealth mode that builds systems and tools to provide assurance and assistance to manufacturers of biologics that have to wrestle with the rising threat of cyber attacks. He's also, in that context, the co-founder of a non-profit called BIO-ISAC, which, as its name suggests, is about sharing information and analysing those cyber threats. He's an interesting character with a particular interest in this intersection between cybersecurity and biopharma, biomanufacturing, and particularly raising awareness of the threat of these cyber intrusions to businesses in the biopharma sector.
It's a field that certainly I don't know much about, and I'm almost certain that many of our listeners will not be familiar with this space. So I'm looking forward to a very educational discussion.
Yeah, I think the scale and extent of these threats never really gets talked about widely. So also looking forward to digging deeper as well.
Let's get started then.
Let's go. Welcome, Charles. Great to see you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We wanted to talk about cyber attacks and their implications for biopharma and biomanufacturing. I mean, I guess everybody's really aware of the rise that there is in phishing, scams, ransomware, and just a few weeks ago we had this CrowdStrike outage that happened that kind of took out hospitals and grounded airliners and caused a massive losses across S&P 500 companies, like billions of dollars, yeah? So I think everybody's aware of the threat of these intrusions. But the question that's on my mind is, what's the threat in the context of biology, which is becoming ever more digitized, and we have these technologies and instrumentations that are reliant on interconnectivity. I would say my impression is most people in biology don't think about this at all. Do we need to be worried, and why do we need to be worried?
Yeah, in a nutshell, yes. The threat is basically existential to the way we do biology today. We tend to think about it on an R&D side, but actually it's more existential to the biomanufacturing and the late stage of once you have a drug and you're producing it, the ability to have doses out the door is reliant on that entire stack. The same stack, we're using operating systems, we're using firmware, hardware, the entire stack, right? All of the QA, QC instrumentation that we use in manufacturing is all running software and firmware. And so the reality is that over the last few decades, what we've seen is that the digital sphere has permeated all of our critical infrastructures. And that is no different in the health and public health sector. It just isn't. We've seen a spate of cyber attacks on hospitals, so healthcare providing organizations, but a little bit upstream of that, where do we get the drugs? Where do we make them? And so unfortunately, that is just as vulnerable, but has received a lot less attention. And so that's why if you were to weight the risk, I think the risk is actually much higher in the medical countermeasure or vaccine or biological manufacturing side than it is on the healthcare provision side.
Why do you think we don't hear so much about it?
Well, when you attack a hospital, it's very easy to conceptualize what the impact is. We've had attacks on a hospital in Germany, for example, where that was the first case where publicly people have linked an actual death of a person that was turned away from the ER because the hospital was inoperative. Here in the US, we've had entire hospital systems get shut down. In Florida, for example, as a result, or in part, as a result of long-standing ransomware. We've had University of Vermont medical system had to switch back from electronic to paper systems for 3+ months because of a cyber attack. And so it's easy to conceptualize it that way, but it's much harder to realize that when you open your medicine cabinet, that thing is just as vulnerable. It's just less tangible. You get a little box with your pills in it and you take it and you go to the pharmacy and you get it. But if you're a doctor, recently, for example, you know that there have been shortages of cisplatin. And so what happens if the few places that manufacture these drugs at very high standard, because we have to trust them, they have to be safe. What if cyber attacks can actually affect that integrity, which unfortunately they can? We don't think about that too much. It's an emergent threat that has been greatly accelerated by COVID. That's what happened. All of a sudden, that became a geopolitical picture. Every country needed vaccines. Not a lot of people and companies capable of making them, and we all went digital. We all went home, and all of a sudden, like this new exposure, this new cyber domain became vital to all of those operations. And so really what we've seen is a compression of what would have otherwise been a more natural evolution over the course of 3 to 5 years happened over basically 6 months between the end of 2019 and early 2020.
Tell us a little bit about what led you into this area and your interest.
So I've always been interested on the cyber side and the computer science side. I'm formerly trained in biology as a microbiologist technically, but always had this interest in hardware and software and hacking tools, and I always had this interest from the very beginning, but decided to get actual cardinal training in a cardinal science in biology. One thing led to another. I worked at IBM Research, did a first bioelectronic interface where I engineered bacteria to talk to a mainframe computer in near real time, about a couple minutes. And so I was working at this interface between the two domains, digital and bio, for the better part of 12, 14 years. I eventually dropped out of my PhD program to start a company that was funded by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency at the Department of Defense. And that company, BioBright, was focused on collecting digital data and centralizing digital data for the biopharma industry and putting that in the cloud, extracting metadata at scale, very advanced sort of data analytics.
And kind of encryption was really important.
Encryption was really important. We actually insisted early on. We did a modification to our contract with DARPA, and I insisted that, hey, we should put encryption in and we should test it. We had a partnership with one of the national labs here in the country to test it and to sort of break it before we shipped it. And it resulted in a very secure system. And so what happened very quickly when the product started going out to the market in biopharma is that we were handling, we're talking terabytes and terabytes, in some cases terabytes an hour of data for certain big biopharma companies. And so we saw the data coming over the wire. We were like, well, what happens if it gets corrupted? And so we started playing with the formats and realized that there wasn't much integrity there. There actually wasn't much security built in. And once you start realizing that, you ask yourself, the natural question is, well, what is the effect of having a corrupted data file? In most cases, the software won't open it and you think you've lost some data set and you're a bit annoyed, you have to repeat an experiment. If you're lucky, you haven't lost the sample, right? Because sometimes the sample is really rare. But then you start asking yourself the question, well, what prevents me from just nudging the result from saying a negative to a positive? And we tested those things and we realized that it was incredibly easy and that there was a need for actually much stronger security. That basically the digital backbone that we rely on to do research, development, clinical, manufacturing, packaging, shipping, and delivery, the entire life cycle in life sciences, is vulnerable and was built really in an era where there wasn't it was not an offensive digital environment the way it has emerged in the last, let's say, decade in everything, in our cell phones and everything. So now this technology that was never built with security in mind is now thrust in the front, is a critical capability for countries and to keep our populations safe, but it was never designed to withstand any attack. And so we started doing that. I started raising this issue with governments. I worked a lot during COVID, protecting biomanufacturing facilities. There was one incident that we were public about, we shared publicly, called the tardigrade attack. that affected a North American biomanufacturing organization in the height of COVID. We're talking spring 2021. This organization that's producing a large amount of vaccine for a country, all of a sudden is rendered inoperational due to ransomware.
Can you say what that company was?
No, I can't say the company. One of the deals that we did, and this is something that we have to fix, is that the company asked to remain anonymous, but in exchange they allowed us to tell the story.
Right.
For every company like that, I can tell you there's about 70 to 100 that never, ever, ever, ever talk about it. And so there are recent cases in the public domain. I'm only going to mention a few. Evotech suffered a major ransomware attack.
So that's a CRO, yeah?
That's a CDMO, correct. In Europe, a German CDMO, publicly listed, that was dramatically impacted. The CEO came out and had a number of appearances where they said that they understood the impact of that attack on the integrity of their workflow. And that should be the telltale sign. If a cyber attack can affect the integrity of the scientific process, then we need to rethink about how we secure that scientific process, because we can't afford to have medicines in our cabinets that are not trustable. And unfortunately, that's the situation that we're in. So all of that comes back to the point of that's why it's significantly at risk. And so flying around during COVID and mitigating a lot of these things, many of these events will never be public. The one that is public is the one with tardigrade. It was an eye-opener to realize, we think we can manufacture safe and efficacious vaccines. But in reality, a couple of bites in the wrong place change our assessment of whether that is safe or efficacious. Whether it's perception or actually rendering it unsafe is also a possibility. So that's something that we need to change. It's an evolution that we need to go through.
It's a kind of gradation, yeah, is like there's changes that actually are harmful, and there are changes that mean you're not actually producing the thing that you say you're producing, even
which
if they're
means
not
you cannot
harmful.
sell it.
Which is, because the FDA says you can produce this, but they didn't say you could produce that.
Correct. And we've seen a number, actually, as recently as last week, we've seen rejections of drugs due to manufacturing integrity issues. I won't name the companies, but it's easy to find.
This problem of if you're a company and this happens to you, do you go public with what's happened? Yeah. So how many examples where people have come out in the open and said our product changed and this was because of an attack? Or are there just situations where, for instance, the FDA has said this product doesn't meet our requirements, and so now we're closing you down until you've proved to us that you're making the product that we approved,
Yeah, that latter question of, and obviously I can't speak for the FDA, but the letters are public. And there have been a number of letters in the last few years that have actually stopped production or denied approval for drugs on the grounds of manufacturing integrity concerns. And those are public, you can find those. Now, how many of those are due to cyber attack? That I don't know. But the reality is that, yes, of course, and we have regulatory authorities that do their best to make sure that those things, and they work very hard to make sure that those things are safe, and they are indeed the thing that you said that you were producing. The problem is that all of that integrity and that security and that assurance, because that's really what it is about assurance that the end product is what you intended to make, is based on a very, very fragile ecosystem of software and hardware and firmware that was never built with an offensive cyber environment in mind. That's the very real threat that we're facing today. We need to, little by little, change those components so that we can actually have end-to-end assurance. So that it's not just, do I trust the people at FDA to have done a good job? Do I trust that the company is telling me the truth? How can I verify? At the end of the day, that's the question. How can I be assured? How can the American public, how can the world be assured that that is done? And those are very challenging questions. It varies. How are you doing your QA/QC? What files are you using? How did you ensure that somebody didn't go in at 3 a.m. and change the values in your file? There are regulations that exist against this, particularly 21 CFR Part 11 compliance and 21 CFR, the Food and Cosmetic Act, that talks about this. But again, they were not designed with an offensive cybersecurity reality that is today. And so we probably need to revise and, more importantly, enforce a lot of the proportions that are in there so that they are resistant to offensive cyber action. That for sure is a major issue for the field.
I'm wondering, is there any industry that has successfully managed these risks and where biopharma can learn from?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's one that I look for inspiration all the time, is how can we shorten the learning cycle? Because having problems on your iPhone or your computer or whatever, or you get hacked, that can be life-altering. Let's not kid ourselves. But at the end of the day, you can always take a hammer to that piece of hardware or put it in a blender. Eventually, it will stop working. With a vaccine that you've put in your arm, that's not an option. And so there is a question of trust at the end of the day is what we need to be safeguarding and assuring. Unfortunately, we haven't found yet a critical infrastructure sector that has done this successfully. When you look at the history of attacks on the power grid, attacks on fuel, chemical industry, you see that those industries have learned, unfortunately, by successive crises.
Right.
And that's scary enough. But how many dangerous vaccines can we put out? How many crises can we afford in our field? That's the key question. Water treatment plants, there's a lot of water treatment plants in the country. One going down is definitely a problem. One not treating water correctly is definitely a problem. But there are lots of ways to sense that going wrong. In biology, it's way, 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 way harder. How do you know that the content of a vaccine is exactly the one it was supposed to be? There are QA/QC steps that exist, but those are also digital. At the end of the day, one of the challenges that we have that's different from the other critical infrastructure sectors is just to say how hard it is going to be and how little margin for error we have in our sector compared to other critical infrastructure sectors, is that at the end of the day, in let's say oil and gas, if a valve is kept open when it should be closed, or a safety circuit is kept open when it should be closed, or when, for example, a Ukrainian power plant gets shut down when it should not be shut down, like we saw in 2014 and 2017 with those attacks. Those have very loud physical, like you can see those valves shutting down, you can see even physically, okay, the valve is closed, it should be open. In biology, a methylation group is there only 30% of the time when it should be there like closer to 100% of the time. Now all of a sudden your drug is not effective anymore. How are you going to measure that? It was approved while it was effective, but now all of a sudden somewhere through in the manufacturing, somebody sophisticated or with good access decided that no, your mRNA vaccine will not be 95% effective anymore, it'll be 20% effective. Those are the challenges that we don't have a lot of observability. Biology is also stochastic all the way down. We're making exquisite molecules and extremely complex, arguably some of the most complex technology we have.
Absolutely, yeah. We don't really understand any biologic, yeah?
Bingo, that's the problem. The only thing that we can do is, not to go back philosophically to Plato's allegory of the cave, but all we're looking at is pictures on the wall. And that's okay. We're getting better technology every day where you have to do mass spec, you have to do HPLCs, you have to do... There's actually very sophisticated characterizations. And not only that, but the clinical efficacy is extremely expensive, extremely complicated, has an enormous attrition rate in terms of what compounds work and what don't. And so that is why on a couple of these key modalities, we need to build a level of assurance that we haven't had to build before. But the reality is that today we can't afford not to build it.
So many of the examples that you have given us are related to ransomware, right? Mm-hmm. And that seems to be like a serious problem. But in the case of ransomware, somebody would mess up with your system and they would say, oh, we messed up with your system, so either you pay us or we don't give you the code so that you unlock your system and it becomes functional again. So in that case, you know that there's a problem and you know the way out, pay. Is that the main problem, or are there cases which I would consider much more problematic of what you could call bioterrorism, in which people don't tell you and we just want to mess out with the vaccine production for the United States or for a country in Europe, and we're just going to screw you over and do an attack we won't tell anyone because the goal is not to get money. The goal is just to screw people over. So is that equally common, less common? Is that a threat that keeps you awake at night?
Yes, this is the threat that keeps me up at night. That's the thing that I wake up to every day and wonder whether I'm going to see a headline. That really is a thing I'm concerned, just because biology is a means to improve people's lives. Biology is a means to fight disease, to slay one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, to improve the human condition. But it is becoming a technology that malintended actors can use against us. We've seen it historically with the development of biological weapons, weapons of mass destruction that some groups have developed, some countries have developed for a long time. While that worries me, and that is the thing that keeps me up at night, because we are not adequately protected against this kind of scenario, and we are not pouring the requisite amount of effort. There's not a lot of defenders like us that stay up at night, flying around and defending these core capabilities. We should have a lot more. While that worries me, I also don't want to say that that is, by volume, the thing that's going to happen the most. Because by definition, exquisite capabilities are wielded by more sophisticated actors, and then you have to ask yourself the question of, what's the interest? Why would a country want to do this, knowing that it doesn't do so in a vacuum? It's bound to be spied upon, maybe they'll get found out, and maybe retaliation is not worth the attempt. So in that particular case, what I worry about, in that exquisite scenario, I worry about geopolitical actors that are irresponsible and are interested in sowing chaos rather than being important players on the geopolitical scene. Whether you agree or disagree with the conception of the world is a different thing. But to see the world burn or to set that kind of precedent, I would hope that there are few countries and few actors that would go this. My problem is that, knowing what I know, is that the bar is far too low. I would want the bar, we have to heighten the bar so that only the most sophisticated and the larger geopolitical actors, just like cyber, can wield these kinds of larger effects. Because then it becomes more of a geopolitical problem, which can be stabilized through many different means, diplomatic means and other ways. So that's on the exquisite scenario. We need to raise the bar, and we need to make it really difficult for smaller, more chaotic actors to deny them the capability of disrupting the world in this way.
Would they be nation states, or would they be criminal gangs or lone wolf hackers?
The sophistication required to do these kinds of things is unacceptably low. This is not the realm of countries even. Some even moderately sophisticated groups that in an accident, because they're trying to make money, could cause this kind of effect is unfortunately a reality today. That cannot stand. That cannot continue to be the case. And so that actually is a nice segue to the other piece of what you asked, which is far more likely cyber has become now a way, with ransomware in particular, to make money. To make a lot of money in many cases, right? If you look at some of the ransomware gangs, when they bring in a month, these are eye-watering amounts. And so what I'm concerned about is that the bar being so low, even folks who are just interested in making money through illegal means will cause enormous effects on infrastructure that we don't have that many lives on that infrastructure. We can't afford that many crises. And you see this, to make it very concrete, you saw it recently in the last few months with the REvil ransomware gang operating out of Eastern Europe. There was declassified information and indictments that showed that they had a link to Russian military intelligence, for example. They hit a number of hospitals in the US, which caused enormous downtime, enormous effects. And eventually they said, oh, sorry, our bad. We didn't mean to hit a hospital. We're just trying to make money here. Our policy going forward is that we are not going to be hitting hospitals. Sorry, our bad. My concern is that the bar is far lower, even in the life sciences side, is that on an accident like this, we could be losing a massive amount of our capability and, more importantly, of the trust that we have in the products that we all have to take, especially on the potential dawn of H5N1 and Mpox, on the heels of COVID. We really can't afford that many crises in this sector, and we have to work pretty quickly to defend it so that these malevolent actors, especially the lower sophistication ones, that this kind of attack becomes out of reach for them.
So let's talk about the solutions to this, because you've been emphasizing this issue of we need to do something about it because the bar is so low. Who is in a better position to address these problems, right? If it's cyber attacks and ransomware, I would say that the company under attack has a vested interest in sorting out the problem. At the same time, you could argue that a federal agency may see this as a priority and they would want to find a solution that benefits everybody in the biopharma space. So who do you think needs to take the lead?
For sure, the organizations need to be responsible for their ultimate security. Organizations cannot and should not rely on governments to defend them in the moment of an attack. This is something that we've seen not just in our field, but you need to be ready. You need to have plans in place. The most important thing is that most organizations right now just don't believe that it will happen to them. And then when it happens, they have no plans in place, no mitigations, no response plans, and they're left scrambling, often to realize that what is often considered to be a tiny IT issue can actually balloon into a regulatory issue, and an actual safety and integrity of the product issue has enormous impacts on GXP compliance, for example. But most companies don't realize that. And so the most important thing is to do an open-eyed assessment, and sort of a crown jewels analysis of saying, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen to us? Is that we just paid $5 million for this batch? Is that we have to flush this thing down the drain because our CRO got hacked or our own company got hacked and we can't guarantee the integrity of those systems? Those are probably kind of the worst case scenarios that can happen, because it's a lot of financial impact, but it's more importantly, it's a loss of trust between the company, the regulator, and ultimately the public. That's the important thing I would say, is that most people are trying to act in the best interest and they want to get doses and product out the door. Everybody's working very hard to get safe product out the door. Realize that cyber is actually an element that is non-negotiable anymore. You have to put that into the equation and defend against that. That's the first line. It's also, however, undeniable that governments, not just the US government, but governments around the world, have to make cyber a core equity of quality, pharmaceutical quality. That is not explicit currently in the regulation. There is sufficient grounds with current regulation around 21 CFR and the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act to actually build that in, but it needs to be enforced.
And does the FDA have the resources and the expertise to do that?
That's a great question. It's clear that resources are strained right now. And if you look at the bioeconomy writ large, not just biopharma, growing as it is, it's going to continue growing and is going to continue putting strain in an environment where FDA already doesn't have enough inspectors, already is too burdened. A visit can last 2-3 days at a time. There are ways, and this is what Black Mesa is working on, is actually ways to provide assurance, like cryptographic and mathematical assurance over a production workflow in a way that streamlines the assessment process with very deep cyber and sort of mathematical foundation to it. But make no mistake, the current picture and the trends, we are heading towards a FAA Boeing problem here. Like the same problem where we are already letting organizations self-regulate, quote unquote, and we just trust that they're doing the right thing, only to find after an incident has happened that there was an issue. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. There was eye drops that killed a handful of people here in the US that were manufactured in India. Later inspected, found that the biomanufacturing facility was nowhere near what it should be. Okay, well, people had to die for us to find that out.
Cyber was involved in that?
No, I'm not suggesting it.
Because these kind of things, I'm thinking of the heparin scare back in 2008. Yeah, it was like, that's the archetypal thing where the supply chain everybody's using is contaminated with this thing that starts killing people, yeah?
Yeah, so no, there's no evidence that I know of that points towards a cyber component. What I can say, I will give you a case where we know, for example, from a few years back, there was an Indian biomanufacturing organization that got found out and had an issue where it looked like they were monitoring the instrumentation, and when it was headed for an out of compliance, they would actually unplug the machine. So it's kind of a very low and away, but it would crash the machine, and so that the result wouldn't be there. There is, and this is still ongoing, is my understanding, with Abbott and the milk shortage formula, was actually, there is some evidence, and I'm not imputing any fault or anything here, but there is some evidence to show that the facility was not up to quality, and in fact babies died as a result of contamination of the milk formula. But it's alleged that there were batches manipulations. So they would time the batches in such a way that each batch would not fall under sort of an out of spec or something like that. Again, there's active component. My understanding is there were 2 whistleblowers in that particular case. Ultimately, that will have to work its way through.
So is the worry, I mean, we're looking, 20th century was the century of small molecules.
Yep.
21st century really is the century of biologics, many of which are now very proven, very well characterized. We understand what they do. Almost like any nation actor can use this technology. It's not difficult to understand. It's not right at the cutting edge. So in those cases, is part of what you're saying is like many more organizations, companies around the world are going to be making these things, and that's one of the reasons why we need to be more vigilant.
As you're rightly pointing out, biology is playing a larger and larger role in our economies. I think the latest estimate is around 7 to 9% for the larger bioeconomy, 7 to 9% of US GDP. That's not just biotherapeutics, it's a larger class. That increases its prevalence. It also increases its market share. It means that actors that want to make money off of ransoming or want to steal IP, there's lots of opportunities there. And so the key is to realize that this is not just any industry like another. It's not like you're just buying a car or a phone or something where you can choose not to use it. Or it's a technology that is fundamentally like, okay, if you want to dip your toe in self-driving, for example, well, you can supervise what it's doing. You can take over. And we accept that we have to build safeguards. The fact that the human, for example, can take over at any point, right? This is the whole debate that we're having around with self-driving. Well, the question is, how do we prove that there is safety, efficacy, and assurance of the end product in our field, given the modern reality of offensive cyber today? It's just not the same as in the 90s, where maybe there were fewer offensive actors. Now, everyone and their mother can learn to hack. A guy in a basement can hack some of the largest corporations around the world, steal intellectual property, could even cause denial of service. Do we accept as a society that the biologically produced products that go into our bodies, do we accept that those things are unsafe? I don't think the public will accept that and should accept that. So the question is now, how can we trust that? How do we build transparency? How do we build the right standards and the right assurance for that environment? That's going to be a long and arduous road, for sure. Not all biological products should also be treated equally. If you're making a spider silk tie, okay, well, maybe it has a few more impurities. What is the real risk to my life? But a vaccine that we need in certain quantities for Mpox or H5N1 with certain efficacies to try to limit the loss of human life, those have a much higher bar. And so we should make it such that not only is it immoral, regulated against, to attack such infrastructure, right? And maybe there are legal frameworks we should follow. You shouldn't be firing at an ambulance, even in a war setting, but it's okay to destroy that country's ability to produce vaccine. We have to set clear lines there, I think. I think we have to be more open and public about the things that are indeed happening, how bio can be used in a nefarious way, right? We have seen certain countries use biology as a means of repression and oppression of specific subgroups of populations, tracking them genomically the same way that they would do facial recognition in the street. Which conception of biology do we want to live with is ultimately what's at play here. We're not realizing this. We're not saying it explicitly, but we should be saying it explicitly. Do we create safe and efficacious products that help improve people's lives? Or do we let this technology be corrupted and not push back against immoral and offensive uses of that stuff? We have a biological weapons convention.
So you're saying we need something like that with a cybersecurity aspect to it?
Absolutely. We should do this in the norms. We should develop international norms. The US government is taking leadership, for example, with the BIO-5, which is a recently announced group of 5 countries or 5 groups of countries to work together to reduce shortages of active pharmaceutical ingredients, to de-risk the access to those things, because if a certain country is able to choke the supply of those things and we are unable to make our vaccines for our own citizens, that is another type of attack. So we are already cooperating and setting the standards for doing this and improving trade and improving the capability of having cross-regulation. We should make it easier, standardize those norms. And so that's in the norms category. We should not stand to let these industries be hacked. And when they are hacked, we should shame and declassify and share information about who's hacking who and why and to what goal. That should be done, because biology is not just financial risk at play here. But the other thing is we should also defend this better. And this is back to your earlier question. This is where we need to spend a lot of time and a lot of effort, and where governments play a key role. This is a critical infrastructure. We have to defend it. We have to push for it. And there's a lot of work on that front. Government has to invest in this arena, and it is woefully underinvesting in this space.
Let's go back to one point that you made a little earlier. You were alluding at some point that all the points in the drug discovery process, from research to manufacturing, distribution, are susceptible to different aspects of cyber attacks, and I think that's pretty clear. Let's talk about cyber theft, which has to do more with IP and these kind of issues. It seems to me that certainly for our listeners, it may be quite interesting, because a lot of this IP gets generated at universities, it gets generated at startups, right, which have a different financial situation. They are not as wealthy as a large corporation that can afford to say, let's spend a few $1 million on an infrastructure. They operate on a shoestring sometimes. They don't have capital for this. So what kind of strategy do you think they would need to take so that they reduce the risk that they are exposed to?
Well, so that's something that's near and dear to my heart and to my co-founder on the BIO-ISAC side, the nonprofit side, Whitney. We have published actually publicly available postures, network reference implementations that are freely available on the internet. You can just go to the isac.bio website, download that and say, hey, I'm a new startup company. I need to build a network. I have no idea how to do this because my job is to pipette and make the science work. And I don't have millions of dollars to secure that infrastructure. Where do I start? And so for anybody who's in that position, our nonprofit has published those plans. We're going to continue to publish more. We have also published an entire framework around this, which includes a vendor vetting questionnaire. How do you vet your vet? Because you're going to have to buy software. You're going to have to buy instruments. You're not reinventing the wheel every time. You need a plate reader, or you need a particular qPCR or HPLC or whatever. How do I know that one is good, is secure enough for what I want? Like, I can't spend millions of dollars building walls around every piece of instrument. I can't afford it. How do I differentiate which one is better than the other on this particular dimension? So we have a vendor vetting questionnaire. Download it, use it, send it to the vendor, ask them to respond, and it has a key to help you understand, okay, well, here is the risk that I'm accepting in these pieces. Those are resources that exist that we're going to continue to push out. But the thing that I really want to demystify is that it doesn't take millions of dollars, actually, to defend against this stuff. All you really have to do is spend a little bit of effort in places like BIO-ISAC and other environments to get the information. It's not difficult to implement a more secure network. You're not looking to make your company into a paranoid, super high security lab. It doesn't warrant that. But at the same time, your equipment shouldn't be addressable from the internet. It should have segments so that you force an actor to spend more money and more effort to get into you, so much so that now, commensurate with your level of startupness, you're not worth it anymore. I'm going to move on to the easier target. Really, you need to run faster than the slowest person. The bar is so low that honestly, with a few hours of work, a few thousands of dollars, you can already outrun probably a good chunk of this field.
Do you see good adoption of these tools that you're releasing?
We see a lot of gratefulness coming out, particularly from the lower end, smaller organizations, because they're unable to spend large amounts of dollars on fancy software. They're there to prove the science, to get the next milestone payment from their VC, or to raise the next round or whatever. So we see a lot of people who are very grateful. We're like, oh, wow, I don't have to build this. I'm spending hours and hours building a questionnaire. I have no idea about security, blah, blah, blah. Where do I go to learn? Those are things that we're trying to empower people to learn on themselves. And so that's been very successful. There is place, in our opinion, much stronger for VCs. VCs are woefully underinvested in this space because the IP, back to the IP theft that you pointed out, God forbid your company is a smash hit success, but unbeknownst to you, because you didn't invest a few thousands of dollars 6 years ago, now your IP is readily copyable, or it's all there, it's all available, all of your plans for the machines that you're making, the QC plan, your SOPs, all of those things available.
Again, that comes down to limitless targets for the attackers. Yeah, it's like,
yes.
So they're going to go after the cash cows.
That's right. But the thing is that in our space, especially in our space, going from a very meager cow to a cash cow happens pretty much overnight. You're doing your trials, all of a sudden you got a really good result, right? And you're posting yourself up for acquisition. You got fantastic phase 2. Like, oh, all of a sudden you went from like, I don't know if this hypothesis is going to work, and all of a sudden it's like, holy crap, we have like an asset that is going to alleviate so much disease and is going to sell well in the market and is fulfilling a need. If you didn't care at all about it, then you're putting all of that at risk. And so what happens is that the culture doesn't change as fast as sort of that transition of value happens. And so all of a sudden, maybe you're at the bottom of a list, but you get bumped up very high because you're solving a particular problem that's either of national interest or you're in the news. A lot of these attackers, what you outlined, a lot of these attackers have to deal with a dilemma. It's just like, I can get anywhere. I can get in almost anywhere in this field today. Where do I go in? Where is it worth me spending my time? And that depends on which attacker. If it's the most sophisticated, then that's harder to defend against. But if you're just a ransomware and you're trying to make money, you're probably trawling like public releases and like announcements and investments announcements and things like that. And we see evidence, not public, but we see evidence that this is how sort of obviously attackers behave.
We kind of come full circle back to that question of how do you get the message out?
Yeah.
How do you socialize these points that you're making? How do you get people to take this seriously? On the one hand, it seems to me that more kind of catastrophic case studies is one way in which this would happen. What are other ways?
Yeah, that's the fatalistic way.
Yeah.
What we are trying to do is bend the arc so that it gets a bit smaller. Because, to be honest with you, as I've said before, I don't know how many catastrophic events we can really afford. At some point, the public is going to say, hang on, and we saw this with COVID, hang on, is this thing really safe? How can I trust that this is safe if every other day I see an attack and that there are governments, and how do I know that what I'm putting in my arm is actually safe? We've already had a first crisis. How many more can we afford here? I think our conception of the world, and I think it is shared almost everywhere around the world, but we should be louder about it, is that we should say, no, we believe so much in our processes. Here is how you can trust it. You don't have to trust me as an individual. Here is the data. Here's the mathematical function. Here are the abilities for you to verify this. So that you can build trust in the regulator, in government, in all of those functions that work very hard, well-intended, that somebody in their basement is not going to negate your trust that you can have in a vaccine that you may be considering giving to your child. That's the number one piece. And so how do we bend the arc faster? We try to share the public evidence of those attacks. So the BIO-ISAC, for example, does a bioeconomy year in review. And we talk about all of the attacks that have gone public in the last year of what has happened to try to socialize this. We also create high trust, closed doors meetings around the country where we actually bring people who have suffered those attacks, that 99% of those are not public.
Is that done with people like BIO, where they bring all of their membership in and then you kind of have this show and tell?
We vet every single person that comes into those meetings. Usually these are 30-ish people meetings around the country. We've had close to a dozen in the last year.
But I'm making the point because if you really want to get the message out, like go to the industry organization.
That's what we need to do. Yeah, that's what we need to do. We haven't done it at that scale. We should. The problem is that the companies that have been affected are unable It is existential for them. They cannot go on a public stage and say, I'm at company X, we got hacked, and the product integrity got affected, and you cannot trust our product, but let me teach you all of the lessons of what happened of the cyber attack and how we mitigated it. No, that's existential. So what we do is we bring those people in a very high trust environment. We vet everybody and we say, okay, you're now amongst peers who are all vetted. Chatham House rules. Share what you can so that when it happens to another one of those peers, that peer has the phone number of the person that had originally responded. Because these are extremely isolating incidents and you don't know who to turn to. So that has been the phase that we've been in with BIO-ISAC up until now. And I think we're now entering this phase of publishing all of the reference implementation so that we lift all boats and everybody can just go to the website and freely get it. But the next phase is to socialize this with larger group of audiences, share examples of threats, and more importantly, the solution. Like, go and get this PDF from our website, fill it out, understand what it's doing, put it on a shelf for a rainy day.
And have Bio or any other biotech trade organization been proactive about this? And have they come to you, or do you think you're not on their radar?
No, I don't think we're on their radar yet. Probably still a bit small, but we have other biotech professional organizations. NWABR, the Northwest Association for Biomedical Research, and North Carolina version as well, which tend to be more academic, but for biosafety. They tend to be more focused on biosafety. Have engaged and are actually members of the BIO-ISAC. We've had national labs are members of the BIO-ISAC. We do a lot of events with the FBI a lot, and the local offices for Weapons of Mass Destruction Division, under which most of the bio works out. Yeah,
very interesting. A topic we certainly don't talk about much, right? And certainly people who listen to the podcast, I'm sure, are pretty unfamiliar with a lot of these conversations, and hopefully they'll start thinking about these issues as they try to commercialize their work. So, Charles, the last question that we always leave for our guests is if you wouldn't mind to share with us what your favorite cocktail is after a long day of
sitting in a hot room in the middle of the summer.
Or right about now,
or when you're panicking about the next cyber attack, you say, "Oh, I need a drink to help me to help me chill a little." What is your go-to drink?
I'm very conscious not to make alcohol the panic response, because otherwise I'd be an alcoholic. But right about now, I'd say like either an Aperol Spritz would be great, or a Negroni would be.
Oh,
a Negroni would be pretty good right about now.
JC's favorite.
Very good. Yeah, it's one of my two favorite cocktails, the Negroni, and the Aperol Spritz is one of my wife's favorite cocktails. For this time of year, it's
perfect.
Ideal. Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Awesome.
So, Charles, thank you so much. Thank you for coming down. It's great to be able to talk to one of our guests face to face here. It's
very unusual. I wish you had more opportunities.
Yeah. So, thank you so much. Really instructive, and we looking forward to seeing how your efforts in this space roll out going forward. Thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was blessed.
Thank you, Charles. Well, Andy, as expected, that was a very informative and educational conversation. I learned a lot about a field in which I have had very limited exposure.
Yeah, I found it really interesting as well. Probably the most striking part of that conversation was there's a real problem. There's a conundrum in that Charles wants to spread the word, but there's only so much that can be shared because those in the know are bound by confidentiality. But I don't know how you get over that.
Yeah, no, it's hard. People who have experienced these problems stand to lose a lot if they share too much. So it's a serious conundrum.
So what are some of the takeaways for you from this?
Well, the two things that caught my attention, number one, that too many people in the biopharma community feel that this is someone else's problem, that this will never happen to them, and that they are not prepared, that they don't have any plans. That seems to be a little bit arrogant, because why wouldn't this happen to you? And in fact, according to Charles, it happens way too often. And then the second thing that is related to that is the fact that you can put together a plan and you can make a modest investment early on to protect your infrastructure. and then avoid a lot of these problems later on. I think that's important to emphasize because whenever you talk about cyber threats, you tend to think that you're going to have to spend millions of dollars to address these problems. And according to the work that he is doing with his nonprofit, that's not the case. It can be a lot cheaper if you act early.
Yeah, I also think in terms of that problem of getting the message out, that he really should turn both to national and international organizations. That's why I brought up BIO. The issue here, as you said, is that something can be done about this. It's just people need to be made aware. And although in a forum such as this you can't talk about specifics, certainly once people are made aware that they need to be thinking about those specifics, then I think this problem becomes much less of a problem. So, yeah, let's hope he is successful in raising people's level of awareness about this problem in such organizations as BIO, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, he certainly sounded like he was interested in pursuing that idea. And I think that it's the logical continuation of the work that he has started, which is quite important, as he impressed on us during the conversation.
So, at the end of the conversation, it was nice finally to hear somebody suggesting a cocktail that you liked.
Yeah, it's not the first time. He suggested two. I'm not too much into the Aperol Spritz, even though I'm very familiar with it. I'm much more of a Negroni kind of guy.
Yeah, the Aperol Spritz, I think, is probably one of the most popular cocktails that's ordered. You know, it just seems to be pretty ubiquitous, especially really bad Aperol Spritzes, which kind of taste like medicine. To me, it can be done very, very well, but if you don't go to the right place and the different constituents aren't done in the right process, then it can be a pretty disgusting drink.
Yeah, you see, the Aperol is standard, right? There's nothing to it. I think the difference comes from the sparkling wine that you use. I suspect that in some cases they must use very cheap Prosecco, which is not made in the traditional way, and it ends up being too sweet, and then it just doesn't marry properly with the Aperol.
I just wanted to ask, did you know what the Aperol liquor is made from? Is it some kind of wine? I know it's from Italy, but I don't know anything more than that.
So Aperol is part of a family of liqueurs called Amaros, right? And there are like a lot of different Amaros, some of which are more bitter, some of which are less bitter. And so, in fact, you can make the same Aperol Spritz with your Amaro of choice. You can make it with Campari, you can make it with Amaro Montenegro, you can make it with whatever you want. I think it's a very flexible template. The sparkling wine with an Amaro and a little bit of club soda. You can go and experiment until you find the one that you like. And some people like their cocktails sweeter, so maybe an Amaro that's not so bitter would be better. Aperol is one of those. But there are some other Amaros that are much more bitter, and they may not be for everyone. So what we will do is we will post the recipe for the standard Aperol Spritz, and then I don't know what you want to do, Andy. Maybe we can list a couple of Amaros that people may try, and then
that's a good idea.
See if people get some feedback on that, right? Because certainly I've tried it with Campari and with a couple others. You have to try until you find the one you like.
Great. So we'll do that. We'll put all of that information down in the description below. We look forward to joining us next time. You can follow us on Twitter. I think it's @TheMixerPod is our handle. So you can get updates on newly released episodes. And, I'm going away, JC, to renew my virus protection software. I don't know about you, but looking forward to our next episode.
Thank you, Andy. It was a good conversation as always. See you next time.
Cheers.
Cheers.